Well, in St. Kitts-Nevis, Prime Minister Dr. Timothy Harris this week tabled the second reading of a bill that would limit the tenure of a Prime Minister to 2 terms in office. He says it would, quote, promote democracy by furthering succession planning and ensuring that the head of government serves the will of the people rather than only the interests of a few. He says the bill was a historic one because it represents the first real attempt to bring constitutional change since the Independence Constitutional Order of 1983. But the main opposition, St. Kitts-Nevis Labour Party, says the legislation needs a special 2/3 majority of all elected legislators to pass, and given the balance of power in the current parliament, the bill has no prospect of being passed without support from the opposition.
I'm here.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Gaston Brown wants a debate about whether Caribbean leaders should be restricted to term limits back on the CARICOM agenda. The issue has been raised previously in Antigua and Barbuda, as well as in Guyana, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So is term limits a reform needed for the Caribbean political system, or are there more pressing reforms required? Well, to answer this and more, we have with us today the Premier of Nevis and the Minister of Foreign Affairs for St. Kitts and Nevis, Mark Brantley. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We also have Opposition Member of Parliament in St. Kitts and Nevis, Konris Maynard. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's Konris Maynard.
Konris.
Yes.
Okay, and a member of the Integrity Group of Barbados and speaker with expertise in auditing, risk and control assessments, ethics, good governance, Krystle Howell. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And member of the National Youth Parliament Association, Kamali, Manics. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Well, Mr. Brantley, let me start with you. Denzel Douglas served 20 years as Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis. Is this move either a reflection of experiences during that time or a move to prevent him from ever becoming Prime Minister again, or is it informed by something else entirely?
Well, I think this move was informed by our commitment given during our campaign that we would seek to engender better governance in St. Kitts and Nevis. We would seek to engage in reforms that we feel augur well for our democracy. It is true that former Prime Minister Douglas has done 20 years. He, of course, is seeking to come back to do more. This bill and this amendment to the Constitution would in no way prevent him from coming back if the people so decided as Prime Minister. What it would do is to limit any future Prime Minister to 2 terms, and indeed it would have limited the current Prime Minister equally to 2 terms. It is unusual in the history of the region that sitting governments, sitting Prime Ministers seek to advance legislation that would in any way limit their power, limit their authority, limit their longevity in office. And so for us, this was a very historic moment in St. Kitts and Nevis and a genuine effort to bring into being a commitment that we had made during the campaign that we would enact reforms to bring about term limits for the head of government.
Mr. Maynard, let me come to you. Why would the opposition oppose a move in which the Prime Minister is placing a limit on his own term in governance?
Right, thank you very much for having us. First of all, the government, as Mr. Brantley mentioned, had made this something they campaigned on in the 2015 election. To change our constitution, as you would know, we need a 2/3 majority in Parliament, and in some cases we need a 2/3 majority from a referendum. However, since 2015 until now, there has not been a single move by the government to invoke the sentiments of the citizenship of St. Kitts and Nevis by way of, say, for instance, an constitutional reform committee. There have been no town halls. There has been no engagement of the public whatsoever. At the eve of a general election, this has been brought to the Parliament. We're not even as parliamentarians. The government sought to reach out to us in any substantive way to say, hey, let us move this forward. let us see if we can come together on this. In fact, when the Prime Minister moved the bill in Parliament, his pitch was to completely attack and lambaste the former 20 years of the Dr. Denzel Douglas administration. This is no way to go about doing transformational constitutional change. It is no way to go about doing the constitutional reforms that we need. So it is not a matter of that we are against term limits, but for something with this magnitude being the first amendment to our Constitution, I cannot understand why we would not feel the need to engage the population to get a sense as to what they feel, since the government did not have the mandate given to them by the people to change the Constitution on their own. And so our position is this: let us do this thing properly. Let us set up a reform committee. Let us look at the critical areas of the Constitution that need immediate reform. For instance, term limits does not affect our democracy for another at least maybe 10 years, because once it is passed, then you have another 10 years before it really comes into effect. And so there are other critical aspects that people are concerned of. Also, we do not believe that this was really a serious and genuine attempt by the government, because here you have a situation in the Nevis Island administration that Premier Brantley leads. He has more than a two-thirds majority in the House there, and the amendment to limit the premiership in Nevis was not a part of it. And so here we have, on one end in the federal parliament, there is support to limit the prime minister to 2 terms, but in a parliament where you have sufficient majority, you have not also included that as part of it. So we don't see this as a genuine attempt to change the Constitution, but rather an attempt to create a headline that, for instance, the opposition caused a historic bill to fail.
Now, Mr. Brantley, I know you may, in this discussion, want to respond to some of the things that Mr. Maynard says. I'm just going to ask you to hold any response you have for now as I bring in the other panelists, but I will give you that opportunity. Krystle, we often hear leaders talk of support for term limits whilst in office, but then fail to enact them. Is this a change that we need to see good governance in the Caribbean region?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on the panel. I'd like to add that we have to first look at what we're trying to achieve. What is the objective? And even listening in on the end of the previous discussion, we are trying to enact good governance, and we have to see the role that this would play where that is concerned. And there are certain things that, in my opinion, need to be in place before you consider term limits. The population size for Antigua and the number of persons that are interested in politics, and not just interested, but would make good representatives, would play a key role as to whether this is something that you would want to implement.
As well as
Antigua, similar to most of the Caribbean countries, historically have a dominance of 2 parties. And when we implement the term limit and we exhaust those parties, what then are we left with? We're trying to root out corruption, and I agree it is a critical discussion that's happening across the Caribbean. But we have to make sure that in our attempt to do so, that we do not trade what is perceived to be one batch of corrupt politicians for an experienced batch of potentially corrupt politicians. What happens when the succession plan does not work properly because we do not have enough persons, once the term limits are up, who are interested and qualified and have enough integrity to fill the role of taking up political leadership within the country? We don't then trade in one problem for another. So we have to first make sure that the perception and the reality of corruption is addressed, so that we do not then have to force tactics onto legislation that may ultimately not achieve what we are hoping to achieve.
Kamali, what impact would term limits have on our political system? Is it the change that we need?
Okay. For my position, I will start it with I am a fan of term limits, and of course, a fan of democracy and proper governance. For me, I think how it can benefit our society, not just speaking on the behalf of Barbados, but even the wider Caribbean, it limits the ability for a person to have, one, excessive authority, two, excessive authority over an elongated period of time, and three, it prevents a person from becoming complacent and comfortable in office. What I will say about the move that was made by the Kittitian government is, again, I find it half-hearted. So I can agree with the statement of the opposition member from St. Kitts. Because for me, there are multiple missing links that I see in that attempt to amend the Constitution. Because one, there was an attempt to limit the tenure of the office of the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis, which I wholeheartedly agree with. But my thing is, one, again, there was no attempt to limit the term of office of the Premier, and two, there was no emphasis on separation of votes. Because presently, the Premier of Nevis sits in the Nevis Island Assembly, sits in the Federal Parliament, and sits in the Federal Cabinet. For me, there needs to be a separation even of that. If you are the Premier and you sit in the Nevis Island Assembly, you should not sit as well in the Federal Parliament and in the Federal Cabinet. So to me, I agree with term limits. I agree with good governance. I agree with safeguards to prevent excessive authority. But for me, the effort was half-hearted. If you want to amend the tenure of the office of the Prime Minister, you also need to look at the tenure of the Premier and even the ability for the Premier to sit in the Federal Parliament and in the Federal Cabinet as well.
Mr. Brantley, before I pose my question to you, I'm just going to give you an opportunity to respond to some of the comments made so far.
Well, there's so much to respond to. Let me start with the last speaker, because he clearly doesn't understand the constitutional provisions here that are at work. It is, to my mind, an odd argument to say that because you don't get all the constitutional reforms that you think are desirable, that something desirable should be defeated by a boycott of the opposition. Now, this was the first attempt to amend our Constitution. This was a genuine attempt to seek to limit the tenure of the Prime Minister. All of us can go through this document, that is our Constitution, and come up perhaps with hundreds of amendments that we would like. But that doesn't defeat the relevance and the importance of this particular amendment. This was the amendment that was before the Parliament. So to say that that amendment, there are others that could have been made, and therefore that one, I agree with the opposition, to defeat that one, is to my mind a non-starter as an argument. In relation to young Konris Maynard, again, I don't know whether Konris is being disingenuous or he doesn't understand the constitutional provisions. He ought to know that whatever majority exists in the Nevis Island Assembly is irrelevant to the question of a constitutional reform that was attempted, because the Constitution can only be reformed by way of legislation in the Federal Parliament. In the Federal Parliament, Team Unity, the government, has 7 of 11 seats. And therefore, we were 1/3 of a seat short of having the 2/3 majority based on the math as I was advised. And so the question really comes down to whether or not the members opposite were inclined to support a measure to limit the tenure of the Prime Minister, not just someone on their side who is seeking again to become Prime Minister, but more importantly, the current Prime Minister on our side, who is saying that as a commitment made to the electorate, we will go down this particular road. Now this red herring about referendum
Mr. Brantley
provides in its 4 corners the ways that it can be amended. And I'm sure all of you would have heard of entrenched provisions, doubly entrenched provisions, as the case may be. The truth is that this particular provision, Section 52, I think it was, of our Constitution, could have been amended by a simple 2/3 vote. It does not require a referendum, as other provisions do. So the Constitution effectively sets up the very mechanism by which it can be changed. And this particular change that was attempted in our Parliament did not require any referendum. There isn't true, and it cannot be said, however, that the people have not been consulted on this, because the Labour Party, under Dr. Douglas, which governed for 20 long years, they had a constitutional commission. In fact, this was one of the issues. And if one were to look at the report, I believe, of Sir Fred Phillips, this matter was ventilated and certain recommendations were made to him when he was in government in relation to limiting not only his term, but the term of other MPs as well. Needless to say, no action was ever taken. So here's Unity, as a government, seeking to take the first action. That is to limit the current Prime Minister and any future Prime Minister. And that bill is presented by the man it will limit, the Prime Minister himself, and supported by all the elected members on our side. Now, I've heard this other red herring about the Premier of Nevis. Well, I am the Premier of Nevis, and I support wholeheartedly term limits both for the Prime Minister and for the Premier of Nevis. The difference, however, is that term limits for the Premier of Nevis would require a referendum, because for whatever reason, the framers of the Constitution decided that to change that position in relation to Nevis, it is a doubly entrenched provision. For St. Kitts, on the other hand, that is at the federal level, one can limit the tenure of the Prime Minister without that referendum. And as a result, we decided that we would move forward with limiting the tenure of the Prime Minister, because we thought that this was an important initiative for the good governance agenda and to set St. Kitts and Nevis and this government apart from what we see happening elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And so that was the whole effort. And so I hear an odd argument being made that you have not gone far enough. We like the idea of term limits, but you didn't do other amendments. You didn't go far enough. The Premier wasn't included. And as a result, it is somehow right that the opposition opposes what they say is a good move. That is to limit the term of the Prime Minister. It is not an argument which to me makes sense. It is one that is convenient. And ultimately, I think we either serious about good governance or we are not.
Mr. Brantley,
this was a measure designed to limit the power, limit the influence, limit the longevity in office of a Prime Minister, bearing in mind that we've had the experience in St. Kitts and Nevis of one man being in office for 20 years, and we all know what that led to in terms of people getting to a point where they start to see the country as belonging to them. They become so ensconced in the seat of Prime Minister that they start to feel that this is their personal property, their personal country. They can do as they like.
Well, Mr. Brantley,
the ethos, the thinking, the underlying push to prevent anybody in future doing more than a maximum of 10 years, 2 terms in office. Anybody who's serious about good governance cannot tell me they're serious about it, and yet they oppose this particular measure.
Mr. Brantley, let me just I would just want to press you more on one of the points you made there, talking about the rationale. Professor Paget Henry, he argues that Caribbean politicians have a tendency to accumulate power far beyond their remit the longer they stay in power. Do you think that's the case? Do you think that prime ministers become too powerful when they stay in office for too long?
Well, absolutely that's the case. And we have examples of it not just across the Caribbean, across the world, where once people there's an old adage, a truism, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we see it whether it's Zimbabwe with Mugabe, wherever we've seen people come to office with the best of intentions, the best of ideas. After a while, with being there for too long a period, you see changes. Because what happens is it stifles the ability of others to come through. When one is in office for 20, 30 years, it prevents young people with ideas, that energy to come through. And we end up in a situation where those in authority for that period of time start to treat it in a way that it ought not to be treated. Limiting the term in office forces those who come to office, 1, to start to work from day 1. They know that their time is limited. 2, forces all of us to have a succession plan, because we understand that we must make way. Somebody else is coming. 3, it allows renewal, constant renewal for the country. And we see it applied in Latin America. I believe there's 17 countries in the Americas that have term limits. Some, like Colombia, have a limit of 1 term. Mexico, 1 term.
Mm-hmm.
Others have 2 terms. We see it in Europe, we see it in Africa, we see it in Oceania, we see it in Asia. I do not know why, having seen it in Belize and Guyana, that here in the Caribbean, we seem, the English-speaking Caribbean, we seem to have a difficulty with the concept. And here we have people who say that they are for greater democracy, for better governance. Yet they say, we want term limits, but we are going to boycott the parliament, not to vote for it, because the premier wasn't also included. And there are other changes that should have also been made.
Okay,
that, to my mind, is not an argument, really, that ought to be made. Because in my view, you're either for it or you're against it. And if you are for it, you had an opportunity to show that you were for it by voting in favor.
Okay, points very well taken there. Mr. Maynard, I know you'll also respond to some of what has been said, but let me just also put to you, do you think there's merit in the view that the longer Prime Minister stays in power, the more they're able to bend the system to their will and gain influence and power to an extent that threatens the system?
Well, naturally, let me respond to that first. Naturally, if you have a system where your internal checks for accountability and good governance and transparency are not up to scratch, then naturally it would leave room for persons to take advantage of that. But I think the young lady who spoke earlier mentioned that if we were to deal with some of these things to blend correction, then term limits really become an afterthought in effect. If you take a look, for instance, of the top 20 democracies in the world that practice a governance structure like ours, it is overwhelmingly the case where the Prime Minister has no term limits. However, the difference is they have stringent and very strong integrity in public life, statutes and legislation, and high levels of accountability. So if, for instance, in St. Kitts-Nevis, integrity in public life legislation that was passed some years ago in the former Labour administration were properly activated, it would give a sense to persons that at least there is a watchdog to ensure that the government ministers are living up to what they say they're living up to. And so if you have, for instance, a good performing government, the people will decide. Another point I want to make very strongly is that in this system, we cannot look at things arbitrarily. Term limits sound good. It is a good concept in order to limit the powers or the longevity of someone to create renewal. All of those arguments are fine. But I am one who is very keen on ensuring that the way we do things is proper. And we can't do things in isolation because it sounds good. Have we analyzed the effect of having term limits in a system like ours? Or do we need to look, for instance, at the Republican system that is the system that really has most of the term limits, as opposed to the Westminster model of system which has least amount of limits? Because that system, meaning the Westminster system, is set up in such a way that it has its own internal mechanism of restricting a prime minister from serving for a long period of time, whereas the Republican system does not have those mechanisms that has. So you need to install to have term limits. So it is worth the discussion, and I prefer that the people of St. Kitts-Nevis have an opportunity to have these things fully ventilated so that they can say, okay, you know what? I have heard this argument, I have heard that argument, and this is where we stand. What is so difficult in ensuring that a monumental decision like this has the explicit support of the electorate whom we are serving? The Labour Party is not saying it is against term limits in any way, but we must not do things for political expediency and for political headlines. And to respond to some of the things that we spoke about, yes, it is true that our constitution is a peculiar one where you have the Premier of Nevis can serve in a local government. He can also serve as a federal government. So right now, the Premier of Nevis can become the Prime Minister of St. Kitts at the same time. Now, that is something that affects us immediately. That can happen tomorrow. And those are things that we need to look at, whether or not it is sufficient or it is prudent or if it is good governance for you to have one man serving in two governments. The other thing that was said is...
Hi, Mr. Maynard, we're having some difficulties with your line there, but I'll come back to you. Krystle, are you with us? Okay, we're having some slight technical difficulties there, so we'll just give our technician a chance to sort those out. Mr. Brantley, are you still with us?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Okay, so let me put this question to you then, as we sort out the lines with the other panelists. Why is this issue being addressed rather than issues of, say, campaign finance reform?
Well, I think that's a good question. We have, of course, a number of issues to be addressed. Your panelists have touched on some of them, the role of the Premier, whether as currently constituted, people can serve in both the Nevis Island Assembly and in the Federal Assembly. I'm hoping you get my friend Konris back on the line, because his party in government had 20 years under the leadership of Dr. Douglas. At one point, his party had an absolute majority in the federal parliament, and therefore, in my view, had a golden opportunity to address a lot of what they now say need to be addressed. The truth is that our Constitution, which has existed since the 19th day of September 1983, has never had so much as a comma in it changed. And so when we came to government, we looked at it. And in a way, we thought to say, well, all right, what are some of the things that we can do that would be impactful, but are lower hanging fruit in the context of the Constitution? Because, as I said, to change the tenure of the Prime Minister is impactful in our view, but it doesn't require us going to referenda. And for the record, referenda in our Constitution means a two-thirds majority in St. Kitts, and separately a two-thirds majority on the island of Nevis. So we're talking about two referenda. One on St. Kitts, one on Nevis, and it must get two-thirds both places. That is the extent to which some provisions of our Constitution are entrenched. And so when we looked at it, we decided this limiting the tenure of the Prime Minister can be impactful, it can send the right message to our electorate and to the world, and it is achievable by a simple two-thirds vote in the Parliament. And so, in a way, we decided to proceed in a particular way to send the right signals, to start us on the path, understanding that there are other aspects, such as you mentioned, campaign finance reform, etc., which are arguably more difficult to achieve in terms of how ultimately they're put together. This is not to say that they're unimportant, because I think campaign finance reform is one of the most important issues.
Okay, let me come to Krystle now. Are you back with us? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Mr. Brantley. I thought you'd finish your point, but let me come to Krystle. Krystle, are you back with us?
Yes, sir.
Krystle, if our institutions are strong enough to keep our leaders in check, then do we not need term limits?
Term limits is one tool that can be used, and it has to be taken, everything has to be taken into consideration. A tool is like anything else. It can be used for good, or it can be used for purposes that may not help to benefit the country. What I am concerned about is the idea that there's only one of two ways to think or to see the country moving forward, and that gives the impression that you're either, if you are against term limits, you are against good governance, which is actually not the case. There are multiple tools that can be used to achieve good governance, and this is one of them if it is applicable to the country of Antigua. Many of the examples that were mentioned before relate to countries that have very large populations or may have other things in place, such as anti-corruption legislation, which is in force, may have persons who are active in making sure that politicians keep to good governance and ethical practices. We can't just look at things in isolation and say, this country has it and it works for them, so it's going to work for Antigua. What factors contributed to term limits working in these countries, and does Antigua have these things in place so that we can make sure that we stand a better chance of it working, as opposed to it being implemented and then you have, look, we tried and it didn't work, but we did our best, but you didn't achieve what you were actually hoping to. What other factors are in place in Antigua to make sure that you will achieve the good governance structure that you are looking for? How far are you along in enforcing anti-corruption measures? Have persons been held to account when issues of wastage or fraud or anything else is called into question? How adequately is white-collar crime addressed, not only amongst politicians but amongst business leaders who engage in these different practices, because politicians don't engage in corruption by themselves? What is the ethical climate in Antigua? And then you can be able to say whether or not term limits will help to address the issues that you're having, as opposed to hearing something that sounds good and is technically good in theory, but we, in the Caribbean context, we have to be able to amend certain things to suit us, as opposed to taking things that we see on the outside and implementing them as they are, because we are very unique, we are very different. We have relationships where you can have victimization very easily. You can have these other things happening. We have to definitely take all these factors into consideration before we implement any one blanket solution.
Absolutely.
Well, Krystle, I mean, certainly we are looking on this show today about the experience in St. Kitts and Nevis, and looking with one eye on the applicability of the very arguments that are being made to Antigua and Barbuda and the rest of the region as well. But what do you think is the most pressing reform for us in the sub-region, certainly in the OECS?
I think similar to the Caribbean Court of Justice, we need to have a Caribbean forum implemented to address corrupt practices and ethics and good governance. The best example that we have in the Caribbean tends to be Jamaica, because of how much work that they've been able to achieve with the Integrity Commission that they have, and they are still struggling to make sure that good governance is a widespread practice throughout politics and throughout the country. I strongly believe if we came together as a Caribbean unit, we would make a lot more headway in achieving these things, because our individual countries are too small. Antigua has a population of approximately 100,000. St. Kitts has approximately almost 60,000. Barbados isn't even 300,000. We are way too small to be able to root out corruption on our own, because of the relationships that exist and the way how deeply rooted some of these things are, where persons don't even recognize that some of the things they engage in are unethical practices. And that educational reform has to happen so that persons can even recognize that what they're doing is not in alliance with good governance. That has to happen. But we are asking politicians to correct themselves and to recognize in themselves something that has gone wrong and that has not been happening. Lobbying on behalf of the population has to happen, because persons need to be able to see the linkages between poor governance practices and its impact on their well-being, on their pocket, in the taxes that are added to make up for money that has been wasted, the effect and the impact it has on them. If that is expressed enough, they will not advocate for change. And the pressure has to come from the population, because it's not going to come from government checking government. That's just the reality. If they're allowed to continue as they were, people will follow the path of least resistance. But it isn't until there is pressure from a population who understands the implications and the opportunity cost of not implementing good governance practices, then is when we will start to see some form of change. And it needs to start happening, because it is a process that will take a long time, but the longer we take to start, the longer we will stay the way we are.
Kamali, if we introduce term limits for prime ministers here and in the region, could we end up in a situation where the person who truly holds the power does not actually hold the title?
Repeat?
That could happen.
Sorry, that question, Krystle, sorry, that question I'm putting to Kamali now. Kamali, I'm just repeating that question for you. If we introduce term limits for prime ministers, could we end up in a situation where the person who truly holds power does not hold the title?
Yes, you can. And I'll tell you why. Because if, for example, you have a person who holds the title of prime minister, majority of our countries are based off of constitutions are based off of system.
Kamali, we're having some serious difficulty with your line at the moment. I don't know if you can get into a better position so that you can make your point clearly here.
Okay, let me shift. Can you hear me better?
Yes, slightly better now.
Okay. So most Caribbean countries, especially the Commonwealth Caribbean countries, our political system is based off of the Westminster model of politics, which comes out of the United Kingdom by its nature. And so our constitutions dictate that the Prime Minister by title is the person who commands the majority in the House of Representatives or the House of Commons or the National Assembly, whatever the individual country chooses to call their lower house. Right? So, if, for example, you do have term limits, which means, okay, after 2 terms, I have to leave office as Prime Minister, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to leave the office as party leader. It just means that the title of Prime Minister needs to transition to another member of my party. So I, as a strong and well-known and prominent and powerful politician, can remain on the backbenches, remain in the cabinet, remain leader of the party, and still dictate the design of government policy. So then you have one person who is a puppet, and then another person who holds the strings. So my thing has always been, okay, yes, term limits is good. Yes, good governance is ideal. But what I think is going to always affect the level of corruption that happens in government is the level of power that is given to the office of the Prime Minister. For example, in Antigua and Barbuda, our constitution establishes not only the 3 arms of our government, but it also creates a boundaries commission. It creates a police service commission. It creates the public service commission. It creates a few other bodies. Through legislation, you've had the introduction of the integrity commission. You've had the introduction of the electoral commission, which happened in the 1990s due to electoral irregularities according to the Commonwealth. Every single one of the commissions and boards that I have named, all of them, the boards are appointed. The majority members of the board are appointed by the Prime Minister. And so you have an issue where if I appoint you and you technically work for me, there's not going to be a proper way of you checking the level of power I exert. Right? And in the same breath, if you don't do what I want, it's easy for me to remove you. Even in the case of Antigua, our Senate reflects the number of seats that our House of Representatives have, which is 17. Right? The Prime Minister appoints the majority members of the Senate. So in some cases, a lot of people would view the Senate as a rubber stamp, because essentially, whatever government wants, government will get out of the Senate. Because it is very simple. If you oppose my government's policy, at any point in time, the Prime Minister has the power to change the composition of the Senate. So by just the strike of a pen, I can replace the entire Senate and have people who will go with my legislative agenda. So then for me, yes, term limits is necessary, but you also have to make sure the office itself that you're trying to check, that it's not only how long a person spends in the office, but it is the level of power a person executes while in that office.
Mr. Brantley, as we wrap up this discussion and you make your final points here, I want to put to you this issue of corruption as well, because Krystle raised the issue. And in our earlier discussion today, we were looking at some revelations that came out in an Al Jazeera documentary this week, in which many of our islands, including St. Kitts and Nevis and Antigua and Barbuda, featured. And we also discussed in a leaked voice note from a senior IMF official that alleged corruption in many of the islands in the OECS. What needs to be done to seriously address the issue of corruption in our small islands beyond just introducing term limits for our Prime Minister?
Well, I think we clearly have a lot of work to do. I would just correct that. I don't think Al Jazeera addressed anything in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Okay,
I think at some point showing our flag and where we were located. But that aside, I think that we do have a lot of work to do across the board. But again, for me, where does the work start? It is no answer to say that we have 100 issues to address and therefore we will defeat this first issue because you have not addressed the other 99. And that I get back therefore to the point that I've been seeking to make throughout this discussion, that there is work to do. And the term limits was an initial effort to embark upon that work, to start to say that those, for all the reasons that my friend has just discussed, the last person who spoke, the immense power that the Prime Minister holds in our societies, in our democracies, small as they are. That is more reason why when a Prime Minister stands up in the Parliament and says, I am passing a constitutional amendment, or I'm presenting a constitutional amendment to limit my own tenure in office and any future Prime Minister, it is because it comes from a backdrop of us understanding the immense power that Prime Ministers wield and the immense power that they hold. And it comes from a unique experience in St. Kitts and Nevis that we had in office someone who had been there for 20 years. And the public, in our estimation, is saying they do not want a reoccurrence of that. So that is what we're seeking to do. In relation to corruption, corruption is as old as Methuselah. It is part of us because human beings by their nature are flawed. And as a consequence, we must continue to put the framework in place to address it. But I have always argued that you put the best framework in the world in place, ultimately that framework has to be administered by people. And so to tackle corruption is not just some people feel that it's only governments. To tackle corruption, I think we need societal norms to change. We need the notion that because I know somebody, I get something done. I get a favor, or in Jamaica, I get a blight, whatever you want to call it, that notion goes away. And so, whilst I understand a lot of the efforts of those who agitate quite strongly for change and who say they're anti-corruption, it seems that they're focused entirely on the political class. When in reality, we need anti-corruption in the business community. We need anti-corruption in the general society. We need a sea change, if you will, to how we perceive these matters. And so I agree that there's work to be done. I think this discussion for me has been very helpful. We understand that if we are to move forward, corruption comes at a cost. It costs the country. It impacts negatively our development. But I go back to where I started and I end where I started. That limiting the tenure of Prime Minister was an important step in that direction. And that we cannot say that we're against corruption, we're in favor of good governance, we want better, but yet we are opposed because we say there are lots of other things that also need to be done. That, to my mind, is not an argument that will ultimately help to advance us. Because if tomorrow we were to say, okay, we're going to go and we're going to do something in integrity in public life, if that requires a special majority, then what is to prevent the other side from saying we're in favor of that, but why aren't you also looking at X, Y, and Z? And so, to my mind, we have to start somewhere, and St. Kitts and Nevis made a good faith effort to put something in place that will ensure that for the future, no single individual would occupy the office of Prime Minister for longer than a maximum of 2 terms. And I thought that that was an important measure, and that those in opposition who boycotted the House to ensure that their votes were not recorded, that history will judge them, and history will judge those of us who sought to make this genuine good faith effort to amend the Constitution. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Maynard, Mr. Brantley puts the emphasis on not just politicians, but others as well, in addressing the issue of corruption. But does more need to be done by the political class too? I mean, you're from a party that had 20 years in power in St. Kitts and Nevis, and yet there's still, it's said, a lot that needs to be done to reform the system to be able to adequately address issues of corruption.
Absolutely. We are a growing democracy. Sometimes we are taken for granted that we're just shy of, we're just over 36 years. And there are a lot of issues that still need to be addressed. I wanted to respond to a couple of things because I got cut off. I'll try to be very brief. Let me just say to Mr. Premier, my good Nivision counterpart, that if there was a singular issue discussed with the people of St. Kitts and Nevis over these last 4.5 years, which was term limits, and the people indicated explicitly that this is the direction they would go, we would support that. The issue here was that between 2015 and the vote we had on Friday evening, there was zero done in terms of discussion that we're even having here today on this radio program. So I think it was a disingenuous attempt at simply making a headline. The headlines were already created before the debate, that the opposition does not support a historic bill, even before the debate was completed. That was the emphasis, because there was no genuine attempt to reach across the aisle to have fruitful discussions on this. There were some other issues spoken about, that you had someone in power for 20 years. When the people of St. Kitts and Nevis were fed up with the leadership at that time, they went to the polls and they voted against the St. Kitts and Nevis Labour Party. Nothing stopped the people of St. Kitts and Nevis from changing the government when they wanted it changed. They didn't want it changed in 2000, 2004, 2010. They wanted it changed in 2015, and they got that. And we must pay attention to the historic nature of the institutions that we have, such as the system of governance, of how they go about putting the necessary checks in place, although it may not be called term limits. We have to look at things, for instance, term versus time. Our system is a system where the government can fall at any time. And so you can literally have a prime minister that a motion is called a year into his government's term. He falls. He only has at most another 5 years. So have we discussed whether we want to do a time limit versus a term limit? These are some of the just basic questions that we have not yet even answered. And it is, I think, unfair to say that if someone is not for term limits, then they are against good governance. That doesn't hold. It means then that you're saying that the whole of Canada is against good governance, the whole of the United Kingdom is against good governance, Norway, Sweden, all of these countries that are Westminster models that don't have any term limits. Are they against good governance? No. They have had their time to put their necessary structures in place that create additional checks on the politicians. I agree with the young lady, Krystle, that in a lot of what she was saying, I would like to get her full name and her contacts, because I don't know her other than now, because I think that she was very thoughtful in a number of the things that she says. For instance, it is going to be absolutely critical that we focus on an anti-corruption agenda. There are just too many questions. I, as a young politician, would love for the fact that someone can hold me accountable through a commission, whatever it is, so that people can have the confidence that when I speak, I am speaking from a position of honor, and that I'm checked out. We have very little of that. And so even if we were to install term limits now, you still have 10 years of, let us say you have a corrupt system, you still have 10 years maximum in a corrupt system. So I would go as far as to say that term limits installed now does nothing to attack the issue of corruption. We still have issues of campaign financing that we are seeing, coming to the fore as we have a number of elections around the Caribbean. These are things that we can do right away. For instance, integrity in public life. Why is it so difficult for us to move on that? What is it telling the electorate that after 5 years of a particular government saying, look, this is the time we are at now, and to date, I, as a member of parliament in the federal government, I have no requirement to submit anything to anybody to check me out. And so I think we have a lot of issues to deal with. Anti-corruption, integrity in public life, campaign finance reform. These things are what are going to be so critical in ensuring that when someone gets into office, whether they last a year or 10 years or 15, that we have checks to be able to keep them on the right side of serving the people. I want to thank you for this opportunity to have had this discussion with you today. It was definitely my pleasure, and I look forward to having many more.
Certainly. Thank you very much. And we have come to an end of this segment, unfortunately, so we're going to have to leave it there. And I say thank you to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
You're welcome.